Thank you so much. Thank you, Sepiti, for organizing this. I hope the sound is good.
Yes.
I'm really honored to be part of this series, and especially given the expertise of my colleagues, comrades, and friends who already spoke before. Um, I'd like to share first with you a couple of ideas regarding the organization of these 2 days. I know that these two essays, earlier papers of mine had been circulated, so I won't, of course, read them out. Some passages maybe we can read together. It took me also some time to get back into the argument, especially particularly the one Sensuous Supra-Sensuous, the aesthetics of real abstraction. However, I'd like to start with more, let's say, low-key introductory remarks and run some slides so that we can have a shared, a common base from where we could start the discussion on real abstraction. I should also say that these two papers and also today's and tomorrow's workshop, they are based on earlier work. Particular to mention is here the 2017, I think, session on abstraction at Beirut's Ashkar Alwan space as part of the homework study program. I think some of the former members are already saw here in the Zoom window. Um, Back then, we already had a session led by Imana Issa, who later also joined a Hegel reading group in Berlin when I moved back, together with Marwa Arsanios, Haitham Uradani, and also Matteo Paschinelli. And out of this, there was another summer school conceived last year where we also studied, partly at least, a real abstraction, yet from a different angle than from Hegel's angle. And the two papers, earlier papers, that had been circulated, I should also say, they are indebted to the work of Maya Gonzalez, especially the earlier paper from 2016. And in a way, you can say what I'm going to do today is a kind of a commentary of my reading of Samo Tomcic's book on Marx and Lacan. That is especially the paper on the sensuous supra-sensuousness. And the introductory remarks are based on Jamila Muscat's seminal article on Hegel and the ontology of social abstraction. So I'll share with you first a couple of slides so that we can run through them first, and then we can maybe go to a couple of sections in my papers that I already highlighted. By the way, that is a seminar, so it means I won't give a straightforward lecture all the time. You are more than invited to join and to stop me and also to pose questions. I'd like to have the session ideally not as an expert talk, but as something that we can share and discuss. I thought we could run for almost 3 hours. However, I suggest to have screen breaks. Otherwise, it doesn't make so much sense. So the first screen break probably we have around, oh no, we're in different time zones. Anyways, in 55 minutes, always at the hour. Sensuous Supra-Sensuous, the aesthetics of real abstraction, as the uh, name is of my earlier paper that was circulated. And in the first remarks, I'd like to say something about that odd title, where it comes from, why I chose it, and something maybe on aesthetics of real abstraction, what means aesthetics here, and what is actually real abstraction. So our starting point probably is quite easy and commonsensical. I just look at the term itself, abstraction, from abstrahere, to drag away, to remove forcibly, to abort, to divert, and in philosophy you may say, to separate by means of the reflective process of the intellectual faculties. And I took from Jürgen Renn's recent book on the evolution of knowledge these two shorthand definitions. You can say abstraction, or the process of abstraction, is the cognitive and historical processes by which abstract concepts are generated, such as generalization from specific cases or reflective and iterative abstraction. And he also gives us a list of abstract concepts. He mentions number, space, you have causality, matter, gene, atom, chemical element, state, mind, color, action, proof, fact, or beauty, typically covering a wide range of experiences and having a large domain of reference with semantic relations to many other concepts. Therefore, as he points out, it's difficult to distinguish just by looking at words whether abstract concepts are part of an elementary classification of the world or part of a rich and powerful conceptual system. In the latter case, abstract concepts are typically the result of a long chain of iterative, like repeating, abstractions. So far, I would say nothing new. That would be what we could call logical, intellectual, mental is maybe too much, but intellectual and logical abstraction. Okay. So the question then, of course, is what could be an aesthetics of abstraction, when earlier I have just said that abstraction refers to logical or intellectual activities of the mind. As we know, aesthetics, or going back to the Greek meaning, aesthesis, perceptions, sensation, is bound to the realm of sensibility or sensualness. Therefore, what is abstract, or what has been abstracted, i.e., has been removed from the sensuous world, cannot be seen or intuited or perceived in a sensuous way. So abstraction and perception, you may say, designate opposite or complementary activities. Following Kant, abstraction belongs to the faculty of understanding and conceptual thinking, while perception belongs to the faculty of receptivity, of sensibility, or to the sensuous world, to that which we can intuit and perceive. So in a Kantian universe, the realm of the aesthetics is obviously not aesthetical. You can even say abstraction is defined by being not non-aesthetical. You cannot intuit it. It is something bound to concepts, to conceptual faculties. However, the ontological status of abstraction as real or unreal or non-real is not yet decided. For Marx, Hegel, and the neo-Marxian theorist Alfredson Rethel, and we'll talk about him a bit later maybe, abstraction can be real and can constitute a real world of real social relations between humans and commodities. In different words, we are looking at a different type of abstraction. So the screen will be slightly smaller, but at least I can navigate. Yeah, let's move on. So what then should be real abstraction? Well, the abstraction of natural science are thought abstractions in mind if you want. The economic concept of value is a real one. It exists nowhere other than in the human mind, but does not spring from it. This is a type of real abstraction, something which is not limited to conceptual intellectual abstraction, as we heard earlier before. That is a quote from Alfredson Rethel's famous book, Intellectual and Manual Labor. So real abstraction designates a certain type of social relations in capitalism that are constituted and framed by commodity relations. I'll say later something about that with Marx. So, following Marx, the non empirical materiality of value is real and material. It all goes back to Marx's term abstract labor. I'll also say something about this later. But for the moment, let's allow for a different type of abstraction which is not produced by the conceptual faculty, or what Kant would call understanding, just as something we can do in mind. We can call this material reality beyond matter, or a material reality made from real abstract social relations. With the concept of real abstraction, the Kantian split between the sensuous or aesthetic and the non or supra-sensuous, you can also say conceptual intellectual world, collapses. Now we can think of a sensuous, supra-sensuous world of supra-sensuous value relations mediated by sensuous empirical objects or objective relations. And that is commodity relations. So just to keep in mind that the jump that I did in the beginning was to define abstraction as it is commonly understood. Now we are with now we are talking about a different type of abstraction, which is something that is created in capitalism as a social relation that is between people, a social relation that is mediated by things, by commodities, however, is not reducible to these things. And I quote from Marx's Kapital, Volume 1, the commodity is a very strange thing. Probably you all know that quote, but I always quote it. It's a strange thing abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is a use value, there is nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it satisfies human needs, or that it first takes on these properties as the product of human labor. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing. In German, it's called a sinnlich-übersinnliches Ding. And now we are there. That is, of course, the reason why that session today is called the sensuous supra-sensuousness. It's just a literal translation of that Marx passage in Kapital, Volume 1. I changed it here, of course. I know that the Ben Fuchs translation has it slightly different. I think it says that commodity is something that transcends the sensuous realm, or the boundaries of the sensuous. Why I changed it and why I think it is so important to change that is basically the topic of the first session today. So in the following, the philosophical subdiscipline of aesthetics is not understood as the realm of the sensible, sensation, perception, and sensuousness, as in Kant's critique of pure reason, and of aesthetic judgment, as in Kant's third critique, the critique of the power of judgment, but employed in a Marxian framework to explore commodity relations as a side of sensuous supra-sensuousness, a side neither strictly speaking aesthetical, sensual empirical, nor supra-sensual, conceptual, logical, and non-empirical, but as you may say, both at the same time. And how this can be is basically the topic of today. First, take on real abstraction and sensuous supra-sensuousness. I start with two examples to imagine that sensuous supra-sensuousness. So something that is not empirical, yet has empirical results. something that is material, yet not made out of matter, something that is relational and has and expresses a social, really existing material relation, but something that exceeds the realm of the imaginary. And the first take on what that could be, I take from Brecht and Benjamin. That is actually a quote from Benjamin's essay on photography from 1931. And there he quotes Bertolt Brecht. And I read this short quote for you. As Brecht says, the situation is complicated by the fact that less than ever does the mere reflection of reality reveal anything about reality. A photograph of the Krupp works or the AEG tells us next to nothing about these institutions. Actual reality has slipped into the functional, the reification of human relations, the factory, say, means that they are no longer explicit. So something must in fact be built up, something artificial or posed. And Benjamin adds to that, we must credit the surrealists with having trained the pioneers of such photographic construction. Without going into surrealism or into surrealist photography, I think we can get the gist of that argument. Brecht simply says that what we can empirically intuit or what we can have as experiential knowledge in capitalism doesn't tell us that much about the function in capitalism. So it's neither the case that there is a hidden world behind it, nor that the sensuous empirical world in capitalism, let's take a factory for instance, is meaningless. No, there's something that shows itself in the empirical world, yet in a displaced, different manner. So we have to understand that we need a kind of a building up, he says, Aufbau, a construction, a theoretical edifice in order to perceive what capitalism or capitalist social relations are. So it's not that there is an ideology or an illusion or ideological veil covering the real things in capitalism. It was rather the opposite. It is that the things themselves stand in the way of perceiving the sensuous, supra-sensuous social relations of capitalism. And if you think this thought a little bit further with Benjamin's remark on the surrealists, you could, of course, say that capitalism is a world where relations are not just real or something that you could give an account of in a realist manner. No, they are also sur and sous real. So something above and below what the reality is. So there's a kind of a network of relations at stake which organizes that which otherwise could be seen in reality with a very simple empiricist, realistic understanding of reality. So this would be one example, or a very old one, in photography, how we could have first a clue about what that world of sensuous supra-sensuousness could be. Brecht's example is here, of course, the factory. And the factory brings me to the second example, should be more precise, the Fordistic factory. Of course, things get even more difficult, of course, in our age after the third industrial revolution. But let's stay with the second industrial revolution. And the second example probably is well known. I take this from Slavoj Žižek. He uses this always, so I'm stealing it. It's taken from a conversation that Truffaut had with Hitchcock. I think it was first recorded in 1962 and then later published in the famous book on Hitchcock. And Hitchcock says, I thought up a scene for North by Northwest. You remember that famous film with Cary Grant? But we never actually made it. It occurred to me that we were moving in a northwesterly direction from New York, and one of the stops on the way was Detroit, where they make Ford automobiles. Have you ever seen an assembly line? Truffaut says, no. They're absolutely fantastic, Hitchcock replies. Anyway, I wanted to have a long dialogue scene between Cary Grant and one of the factory workers as they walk along the assembly line. They might, for instance, be talking about one of the foremen. Behind them, a car is being assembled, piece by piece, in real time. Finally, the car they have seen being put together from a simple nut and bolt is complete with gas and oil and all ready to drive off the line. The two men look at it and say, isn't it wonderful? Then they open the door to the car and out drops a corpse. Truffaut exclaims, yeah, that's a great idea. Of course it is, but not what he thought, I guess. And it goes on, Hitchcock, where has the body come from? Not from the car, obviously, since they have seen it start at zero. The corpse falls out of nowhere, you see, and the body might be that of the foreman the two fellows had been discussing. Truffaut says, that's a perfect example of absolute nothingness. Why did you drop the idea? Is it because it would have made the scene too long, and so on and so on? What interests me, of course, is what is that body? It drops out from nowhere. There is no illusion at stake here. We have been following the assembly line. Everything is in real time, and there is no hidden ground or there is no mirror or whatever. Of course, with Marx, you would say the corpse is dead labor, or you may call it value. Abstract labor as employed and valorized as dead labor, as value, or abstract labor, which is, as Marx put it, the substance of value. So I think we have now kind of not precise, but kind of the idea what this means when I talk, or Marx talks about a world of sensuous, supra-sensuous things and relations. The sensuous factory produces a supra-sensuous body, and that falls out of the sensuous thing. And value in this sense, as a social relation, is that body that seems to come from nowhere, but of course has a place. You can call it the side of antagonism, social negativity. You can also call it proletariat, of course. And everything that is related to that, from unpaid reproductive labor, work, care work, to get the worker in the factory, to everything that the state has to do to reproduce that labor power, and then the valorization of the product sold on the market, and the differential, as we know, that Marx has called surplus value. Of course, without surplus value, there is no value either, as capital is a trajectory, a movement, rather than a thing that stays stable and keeps its value. So let's call it a sensuous, supra-sensuous corpse that fell out of that car. It seemingly comes from nowhere, but it has a place, and it has, if you want, a history and a fate. So with this, I move on to the next take on abstraction. Of course, now we're getting closer to what is real abstraction. Can abstraction be real? Let's try it with Hegel. Of course, for Hegel, the problem of sensuousness versus non-sensuousness is different, as he proceeds from sense certainty in the chapter on consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit. And I think they're much more competent members of our seminar today who can elaborate on that. So bear with me, I will just extract a couple of insights from Hegel's philosophy to point at the realness or the actuality of abstraction, other than just being something that is limited to the cognitive faculties of the human mind as logical abstraction, as Kant, for instance, has it. What we could probably say is that that Hegel's philosophy aims at concreteness. It shows how the world as concrete totality is grown together or has been woven together, going back to the original meaning of concretum, con or cum crescere, grown together. So the world that we see, that we live in, not that we see, but that we inhabit as a totality, a concrete totality, is something that has been grown out of abstraction, abstract determinations. So Hegel's obstacle here, of course, is to overcome abstract thinking, a mode of thinking that cannot come to terms with concretion as he defines it. So he has to get rid of bad abstractions or merely intellectual abstractions that assume an already existing concrete world from which it then intellectually abstract and then creates kind of a pyramid of ever thinner intellectual abstractions on top, as you wish, or as an add-on on the seemingly unproblematic concrete world. So bad abstractions, of Hegel also calls it abstract thinking, you can understand according to that pyramid. So on top, of course, you would like to have, as a result, abstract concepts. In Marx's case, you may have then population, classes, property, and essential properties of things, in distinction to non-essential appearances. You start from just below, from an highlight a little bit more. You start from a given concrete world, an empirical life world, if you want, from concrete social relations, from immediate experience of people or whatever that may be. And you assume a pre-intellectual world of appearances that is just there, ready to be immediately experienced prior to intersubjective mediation. Of course, Hegel denies that this exists, and I think Marx does the same. And of course, I would suggest that we follow Hegel here. So, in the meaning of abstrahere, you could say, if you follow that conventional, traditional empiricist understanding of an already given concrete world, what you would do is, by an intellectual mode of abstraction, you would just get rid of, you just would separate the world into ever thinner abstractions. And you could subsume the particular, the already given, under a general concept, under a universal. It's actually surprising how often abstraction is still conceived according to these terms. Hegel, as you probably know, made a big fun of that kind of fantasy world of people who believe in an existing concrete world from which they can simply abstract. And yeah, there is that funny piece that you wrote. Who thinks abstractly? Of course, not I, Hegel, but the others who don't know that. And I tell you why. And I think some of you know that, so I won't bore you with the whole story, but I read a couple of sections of it. It is, it is a market scene that Hegel recalls here, where a maid has been sent to buy vegetables or fruits and eggs, of course. And there's a market woman uh, who, from whom she would like to buy them. And they get into a fight, and this fight is an example of what Hegel will call abstract thinking. But let's go through a couple of passages. So, who thinks abstractly? He asks, and he answers the uneducated, not the educated. So, obviously, not Hegel. Good society does not think abstractly because it is too easy, because it is too lowly, not referring to the external status, not from an empty affectation of nobility that would place itself above that of which it is not capable, but on account of the inward inferiority of the matter. And he goes on, this is abstract thinking, to see nothing in the murderer except the abstract fact that he is a murderer, and to annul all other human essence in him with this simple quality. So basically, you take one property of a person as a token, you take the person as a token and simply abstract the fullness of properties and relations of this person, the entire network of relations and history of this person, and just see one particular quality in this person. That this you make, you elevate it to the general universal token under which you can put this person or subsume this person. And then Hegel finally comes to the story of the marketplace. And she, the shopping maid, thinks abstractly and subsumes the other woman, the selling market woman, solely under the crime that she has found the eggs rotten. Everything about her is colored through and through by these rotten eggs. While those officers of which the market woman spoke, that is, as if as one may seriously doubt there's anything to that, may have got to see very different things. So the story here is that the market woman is so angry at the shopping maid who had earlier said, your eggs are rotten, that she insults that shopping maid not only for her looks, scarf, hat, shirt, and so on. No, she also points at the entire family and curses mother, father, and ancestors of that poor woman that just wanted to buy eggs and was just pointing out that the eggs are rotten. So, in a way, for Hegel, this is the classic case of abstract thinking, because the, the justified or non-justified criticism of the eggs is now elevated to the general marker of that woman, which has caused such a negative affect in her. And so everything that she can sensuously intuit, that she can empirically see of this woman and imagine, including her history, is kind of is colored, as Hegel writes, by the rottenness of these eggs. A very nice example, not very it's not very smelling well, but anyways, Hegel thought that he could deal with this kind of flat or bad mode of abstract thinking and then concentrate just on concreteness. However, you may say there is a different meaning of abstraction in Hegel as well. abstraction is not just bad or results in spurious infinity of what he otherwise calls Reflexionsphilosophie, philosophy of reflection, of the Kantian and post-Kantian kind. No, there's also a concept of abstraction in Hegel, which is actual, real, or social. I take this argument from Jamila Muscat's paper, Hegel and the Advent of Modernity, a Social Ontology of Abstraction. Is really recommended. It's a not so recent, I think maybe 2-3 years old, has been published in Radical Philosophy. I think we haven't shared it, but I can do. It's free. It's an open archive, Radical Philosophy. And Jamina argues there that Hegel has two notions of abstraction. So one, we just heard, bad abstract thinking, just subsuming the particular under the falsely conceived general or universal. And there's real or social abstraction as a mode to determine and create concrete social relations in capitalist modernity. Of course, the capitalist is what Jamila added to it. We know that here Hegel is not examining capital or criticizing capitalist society, but let's call it modern society, and here in the guise of ethical life, of Sittlichkeit and its expression in the modern state and in legal relations. So she produces this argument through a close reading of the earlier pre-phenomenology of spirit Jena lectures, then of course the phenomenology of spirit, and mainly then later the philosophy of right. And real abstraction in Hegel is, according to her, the following. Abstraction is synonymous with the system of all-round interdependence that sustains the totality of the social whole. So abstraction is at place, if you want, on the level of social reality as a concrete totality, where there is a network of all-round interdependence. So concretion, as we remember, concrescere, growing together, concretion is a synthetic process of, I called it sewing, or you could also gluing together abstract, that means less complex or simple, determinations. No, sorry for the typo. Concretion stands for a synthetic expansion of multiple determinations, and therefore, again a quote by Jamila's paper, for the universal to be concrete, it must shape an adequate relation between the form of totality and determinate matters. So social abstraction, basically understood as the fabric of the social. This is what you can get from Hegel, but especially from Jamila Muscat's reading of Hegel. This is a different notion of abstraction. Remember earlier on we had a pyramid that was ascending to ever thinner abstractions under the premise of a given, false premise of a given concrete world from which you can abstract. Now we have simple, less determinate abstractions that are kind of synthesized, glued together, and the social fabric is concretely woven from abstraction until you reach, here it's a plane, it doesn't have to be a plane, you can call it also an uneven and combined plane of social reality. Social reality as concrete totality is something that is on many levels. Here you can have it horizontally and also vertically, interconnected, woven together, made from abstract determinations. Later, when we are in Marx, of course, we can actually identify them. What we get here on the lowest level is obviously the commodity, the elementary form. That is also how Marx starts Capital Volume 1, and then you can go up and up and up. I have not given them Marxian names, but maybe we can do this later. And we can already say that these abstractions that are glued together, they are also cut through by gaps. They are antagonisms. It doesn't really fit. It is not like a social Tetris where you actually get an even plane. There are different layers of different abstractions. And yeah, the more determined it gets, the more concrete it gets, the more complex it is, the more social determinations we have. Of course, the topology here of vertical and horizontal might be misleading, but it is just one way to try to invert the other pyramidical understanding of merely intellectual abstraction as something that starts from the assumption of a given concrete empirical sensuous world from which it could intellectually abstract. I drew here 5 conclusions from Jamila's paper. There are more, but for the sake of brevity, I limited myself to 5 points that are important for the following. The first conclusion is that bad or empty or merely formal logical abstraction can be reversed as an intellectual process. Again, it's a typo. Therefore, it is unstable and inconsistent. While actual social abstraction, as a mode of creating the texture of concrete totality of civil society, is non-reversal, therefore persistent. It's a very, very important point with large political consequences. You can say formal logical abstraction, almost as when you think of mathematical formulas, can be reversed in mind. You can do an analysis, dissolve into elements and elementary parts, and you can synthesize, put them together, and then have again the starting point. And then different ways of how to solve a mathematical equation, a function. That makes them bad insofar that they are unstable. They're consistent maybe on the logical terms, but inconsistent insofar as they do not persist. You can reverse them. And you can reverse them actually in infinity, in spurious infinity, as Hegel would say. While social abstraction, that kind of weird gluing together of more and more complex abstract determination until you reach the level of concrete totality, this kind of abstraction is non-reversal, irreversible, and therefore persistent. Therefore, Jamila insists and repeats this many times throughout the paper. The most defining feature of social abstraction is precisely its non-reversibility, unlike logical abstraction, which is doomed to be superseded. Superseded means you can reverse it, you can undo it. Somebody else can undo it. And with Hegel's refoundation of it, we have a new speculative approach to the finite-infinite relation. Social abstraction, modern capitalism abstraction, endures and remains. Her second conclusion is then, modern bourgeois civil society, of course, that is a society that Marx will later characterize as a society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, is made from abstractions, abstract social determinations that organize the social fabric. So it's not metaphorically speaking made from abstraction, or in terms of, a kind of a what Lukács would have called romantic anti-capitalism. I feel so alienated. The world looks abstract to me. No, the world doesn't look abstract because abstraction doesn't show in intuition. You can feel abstracted, but what you feel is then not abstraction as real abstract, it's something else, it's an affect. So it's not meant in a phenomenological sense or a psychological sense. It is basically the ontology of capitalism. It's made out of, from abstractions in order to reach the concreteness, the uneven and combined level of concrete totality. So this different kind of abstraction implies that in modern society, abstraction, quote from Jamila, cannot be reduced to single individual behaviors, nor to the simple maxim, I think abstractly, therefore I act abstractly. Remember the market scene with the rotten eggs, but rather a dynamic abstraction that acts itself as a driving force of social reproduction. And as a result, we can extract from Hegel a theory of a social ontology of abstraction, according to which abstraction is not the result of an innate or cultural transhistorical capacity of the human mind, but designates a historically specific social relation of modern capitalist societies. And I quote again a longer quote from Jamila's paper. Modernity is unabashedly made of abstractions. Abstract thought is not a historical outcome produced by modernity, as it designates the proper mode of thinking that belongs to the ahistorical faculty of understanding. You can debate this, by the way, when we read later Sonnenredl. Anyways, by contrast, social abstraction, qua really existing abstraction, constitutes a specific achievement of the modern era, an era torn apart by divisions and antagonisms unknown to the previous pre-modern ages. Abstraction conceived as a historical phenomenon appears as the most truthful result of a time that has shattered the ancient ethical life by opposing the individual and the community, by distancing the divine from the human, and by substituting infinite reason for finite reflection. Of course, you could add a very, very, very long footnote to this by opposing the individual and the community, and could say a lot about the modern, anti-modern fantasies of reconciling or uniting the individual and community. Of course, you also would have then a short history of European fascism in that bracket. So modern society, as the argument goes on, modern society is a society in which the social bond is made of abstractions, separations that result in antagonisms. You may say cohesion is produced by and through division. Private or exclusive property relations as the inclusive glue of society. The third conclusion you can take from that argument is then we cannot establish an original genealogy of abstraction. So intellectual, logical abstraction cannot be directly derived from real abstraction capitalism. So already the ancient Greeks invented logical abstraction, actually the Egyptians, if you want to be more precise. We have a history of mathematics, and if you go to rather odd figures like Wilhelm Worringer, remember Deleuze Guattari's take on Worringer in Mille Plateau, you also can have an abstraction in artistic expression that goes back to what you may call Stone Age painting. So abstraction obviously is not something that you can link with Hegel, at least, to a certain mode of social abstraction, where social abstraction has become the dominating mode of the organization and function of society. Abstraction was already there before. That argument later will be relevant for our discussion of Alfred von Rethel. I mean, Alfred von Rethel, without saying too much, would say with Marx, Being determines consciousness, Sein bestimmt das Bewusstsein, therefore, if there is intellectual abstraction, it must somehow be derived from social abstraction. But then you have abstract thought in antiquity, and you have bad news. How do you integrate this in your theory? But we'll talk about this later. So I will come to the fourth conclusion, and I called it here the bad news. Real abstraction will not end after Hegel. It is after Hegel here, by the way, in a dual sense. Following Hegel and also, unfortunately, after Hegel's death, it is irreversible. In Hegel's view, as Jamila writes, neither abstract thought nor speculative thought can liberate modern society from abstraction, precisely because of its irreversible status. Capitalist abstraction cannot ever be reconciled. It endures and persists through the reproduction of capitalist societies. And with the fifth conclusion, might be good news, I follow actually the thread of, or the trajectory of this argument, and ask with Jamila Mascat's paper, can we think of an emancipatory or non-capitalist mode of social abstraction, or you may call it real abstraction? In terms of anti-capitalist struggles, Jamila does not call for embracing the illusion of false concreteness, again, since concreteness is the result of social abstraction, not the starting point of some realm of immediacy bound to individual experience. So to what extent can abstraction function as a strategic tool for mediation that would help to activate new senses of belonging and commonality among the dominated? And I may add here, you can ask with Bertolt Brecht, is there a Umfunktionierung, a refunctioning, a transvaluation of real abstraction possible that could organize social mediation in a non-capitalist sense, rather than calling for the end of real abstraction? So this is what I take from Jamila's amazing paper on the social ontology of abstraction. And so this reading, of course, we have a different understanding of abstraction already. Abstraction as that which produces progressively, well, progressively I shouldn't say, it sounds very teleological, something which produces the fabric of the social until you reach social reality as a concrete totality. Totality just means here the sum total or complete integral of all relations that there are in the horizontal spreading and also in their vertical depth. Again, the topology of vertical and horizontal is problematic, but I'm just referring again to that rather limited scheme that or diagram that I tried to present you here at an earlier page. Before I jump to Marx, maybe, I don't know, maybe there are already questions. So how can abstraction be real? The second take, of course, obviously would be Marx, and that already would mean I would jump into the paper on real abstraction and the commodity form, which is the newer paper, but tell me, how is your level of exhaustion? I would suggest we have 7 here in Berlin, 5-minute break, and we move on with Marx. I only see one finger. That's the person who would like to have coffee. Probably it's. I will have a second, so we win already because nobody's saying anything. But stay here. Marx is the real interesting stuff. We only did this to arrive here. It's the 1 hour of boring philosophy, history of philosophy. Okay, see you in 4 minutes. Hi, Maya, by the way.
Hi, Sami.
I mentioned you because you were the one who edited the earlier paper on sensuous super-sensuousness, but I didn't see you before. So you gotta criticize me, please, later for the second paper.
Okay, I have one comment.
Save it for after the break. Get coffee. I know you're on the West Coast as well.
It's yeah, very.
Yeah, I know. Here it's very late. I get something else. See you in 3 minutes. Hi, welcome back. I would like to, before I jump to Marx, maybe in terms of terminology, I jump back to the diagram. Of course, this is very schematically, so don't quote me here, but Marx said the commodity is a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing. What we have here, the abstract determinations, you may call them supra-sensuous. You cannot perceive them. The sensuous world would be here above. But the whole relational network of intersubjective and interobjective relations would be the realm of sensuous supra-sensuousness, because almost like an inverted iceberg, every thing that you find in this sensuous empirical world here is connected through abstract social determinations and also horizontally connected. So a thing may have a value. A value is made of abstract labor, as Marx put it. And abstract labor is the total relation that all expenditures of labor power have in their being, in their employedness in a given social uh, formation in capitalism with a certain level of productivity. So here you have basically in the middle all these interconnectednesses. You have the realm of sensuous supra-sensuousness. Of course, it shows itself, yet in, you may say, inverted, displaced manner on that sensuous empirical plane. Sorry though, Maya, you had the questions before we moved into the break. You gotta unmute yourself. Otherwise, interrupt me when I speak now. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I actually have a question on page 54, so maybe after you develop some of the concepts.
Oh yeah, okay. So you directly would like to go to the paper. Okay, that's good. That maybe that we can do in, let's say, 25 minutes. I would actually refer to the paper directly. How can abstraction be real? Take two, Marx. There is a quote that you find in both papers, and I always use that. So sorry to be boring, but I will repeat it here one more time. That is that famous quote that Marx later omitted in the uh, uh, 1872 second and following third and fourth editions. So you only find it in the 1867, then German first edition. And when he refers there to the dimension of value, remember in the diagram, it was that interconnectedness of all the social relations that we have, that also can be called abstract labor. He writes, It is as if, alongside an external, to lions, tigers, rabbits, and all other actual animals, which form and grouped together the various kinds, species, subspecies, families, etc., of the animal kingdom, there existed also, in addition, the animal, the individual incarnation of the entire animal kingdom. Again, we can say there are the sensuous animals, and there is the supra-sensuous abstract concept of the animal, but it is on the same plane that you encounter it. Of course, it is not that you encounter it like a real thing, not an empirical entity, but it is there in terms of a material relation or as a non-empirical materiality, and you may call it a sensuous supra-sensuous animal. And in a way, Marx's critique of political economy is a science of this animal. However, I would like to start with a couple of central abstraction or abstract notions from Kapital Volume 1, just to refresh our memory, to understand what out of which abstractions capitalist reality that Marx analyzes is made from. He starts with the commodity, of course, and the dual nature of it. We remember use value and exchange value. And then he moves on to the duality or split nature of the labor that produces the commodity. There we find concrete labor and abstract labor. Abstract labor produces value, or is the substance, as he says, the relational substance that produces value. Value has a necessary form of appearance, which is exchange value. Exchange value is the merely quantitative differential relation between all commodities as value things, or of all commodities as sensuous supra-sensuous things. And thereby you can say the commodity form is that what constitutes an abstract social relation on the plane of concrete reality. And on the next level, the abstract labor as value valorizes itself as capital. Therefore, we have to put the whole conceptual framework into motion, as value doesn't exist as a thing. Commodities only exist as the transitory medium of value relations, not as things that can keep their value, because value only exists when there will have been surplus value. And value plus surplus value is another word for capital. This, in a nutshell, would be the argument that we can extract from Marx in terms of how can we understand capitalist reality as a concrete totality made of abstract determinations. That's also why Marx starts with the commodity, not with classes, class struggle, or experiences you can have in capitalism, specific modes of domination, for instance. And from here, I will switch to the earlier paper and to Marx's fragment on method from 1857-58. However, I will read a little bit from that paper so that we are all on the same level. I start maybe a bit earlier. It is just before the section 1 breaks into the second section. And I start again with the first sentence of Kapital Volume 1, which contains the central problem and challenge of Marx's critical project. And as you remember, maybe the first sentence of Kapital Volume 1 reads, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears or erscheint as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. How then, would be my question, are we to discriminate between the levels of appearance, Erscheinung, and essence, Wesen, without relegating Marx's critical project to a binary logic? When we have appearances and behind there's some essential world of essences. What is the categorical and historical genesis of the commodity's essence, and why can it appear only in this form? Skip a little bit and move to another famous quote. Maybe I share this with you so you can see it as well. Second. Now you can see it. Its analysis brings out, it's the same paper that was circulated, Marx, Real Abstraction and the Question of Form. Its analysis brings out that the commodity is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is its use value, there is nothing mysterious about it, whether we consider it from the point of view that by its properties it satisfies human needs, or that it first takes on these properties as the product of human labor. But as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a sensuous, supra-sensuous thing. Again, that is the quote we had earlier before. It is this peculiar sensuous, supra-sensuous character that turns the commodity into a thing, assuming two contradictory characters. In the sensuous world, it appears as one thing among other things. At the same time, however, it has acquired a supra-sensuous, metaphysical or even theological property. These real yet supra-sensuous or non-empirical properties cannot appear as such. They pertain to a specific social form through which the commodity appears. Commodities acquire the capacity of being exchangeable due to essential value relations that only appear on these commodities in their mutual exchange relations. It's called exchange value. This mode of appearance does not pose a merely epistemological problem, but relates to the split character of capitalist reality and the ontological status of its ruling social form, the commodity form. This is the image that we just discussed. And I read with you the second part, which is section 2, from abstraction to concretion. So in the first chapter of Capital Volume, Marx develops the problem of value, of the value form of the commodity through a presentation, Darstellung, of abstract yet real social relations. Again, we start with the commodity. That is to say, in capitalism, real social relations are constituted in an abstract manner. Abstract exchange relations between concrete commodities and concrete commodity owners weave a totalizing net of really existing asymmetric social relations. We may say irreversible asymmetric social relations. These relations can be cancelled out, annulled, but not be reversed. I take this from Jamila Muscat's paper on what is the real abstraction in Hegel. In other words, in capitalism, relations between humans are social only in this sense. They pertain to a world of abstract exchange relations between commodities. They cannot be developed and analyzed from their inherent thingly or objective properties. For instance, the social relation of workers to their colleagues or superiors is not defined by the material properties of their tasks, performances, mental or emotional affinities, or the nature of their activities. Social relations are mediated objectively through and by objects in their abstract, commodified relation as bearers of value. Commodities are things in their capacity as bearers, you can also say transitory media, and expressions of value. and the value of each commodity is the form of its social existence. However, this form does not present itself as such. Value only appears après coup, on the market, as a relation between things after things as commodity have already acquired a price for which they can be bought. And this is why Marx does not begin with a world of appearances, concretely existing things, agents on the market, persons and activities which can be seen, perceived, or otherwise sensuously intuited. The method of ascending from the base level of abstract social relations to the concrete, grown together, konkreskere level of experienced social reality is outlined in Marx's earlier draft, the Grundrisse, in which he lays bare his own dialectical materialist departure from Hegelian dialectics. And maybe here we use the other slide because it's better to read for you. I think that is shared now, the Grundrisse slide. Of course, so far you would say that is a quite Hegelian reading of Marx, and there are problems, of course, that I shall not forget. We'll discuss this probably later, but to have a starting point on what is real abstraction, I follow this Hegelian, or Hegelian is maybe too unprecise, maybe the reading of Hegel that I got from Jamila Muscat's paper, this kind of reading of Hegel I follow now to read Marx's own method of presentation. And I will read now from this famous passage. You find it in Grundrisse, but also in Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy as an introduction. So, and Marx writes there, sorry, it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, thus to begin in economies with, e.g., the population, which is the foundation and the subject of the entire social act of production. However, on closer examination, this proves false. The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I'm not familiar with the element on which they rest: wage, labor, capital, etc. These latter, in turn, presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, and so on. For example, capital is nothing without wage, labor, without value, money, price, etc. Thus, if I were to begin with a population, this would be a chaotic representation of the whole. And I would then, by means of further determination, move analytically towards ever more simple concepts, from the imagined concrete towards ever thinner abstractions, until I had arrived at the simplest determinations. This would be the upright standing triangle, that kind of pyramid to which I referred earlier. But again, this only functions if you assume there is already a non-problematic, given, empirical reality of concreteness. It's all out there. And Marx goes on from there, when you have just arrived on the top abstraction as subsumption of the particular, from there the journey would have to be retracted until I had finally arrived at the population again, but this time not as the chaotic conception of a whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations. The former path, historically followed by economics at the time, is the path that is historically followed by economics at the time of its origins. The economists of the 17th century always begin with the living whole, with population, nation states, several states, and so on. But they always conclude by discovering through analysis a small number of determinant, abstract general relations such as division of labor, money, value, etc. As soon as these individual moments had been more or less firmly established and abstracted, there began the economic systems, which ascended from the simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need exchange to the level of the state, exchange between nations and the world market. The latter is obviously the scientifically correct method. So again, what is the difference? Abstract social determination are our starting point. Marx chooses, as we know, the commodity. Labor, division of labor, need and exchange. And then we ascend until we reach concrete totality. And there Marx becomes gets very clear and explicit, puts basically his Hegelian cards on the table. The concrete totality is concrete because it is the concentration, or Zusammenfassung, gathering together, maybe it's better, of many determination, hence unity of the manifold. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore as a process of concentration, gathering together, as a result, not as a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality, and hence also the point of departure for intuition and representation. Along the first path, the full representation was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second, the Hegelian path, the abstract determination lead towards a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought. In this way, here comes now Marx's critique. Hegel fell into the illusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought concentrating itself, probing its own depth, and unfolding itself out of itself by itself, whereas the method of ascending from the abstract to the concrete is only the way in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduces it as the concrete in the mind. But this is by no means the process by which the concrete itself comes into being. Maybe stop here and jump. Maybe we have already a couple of questions where I could stop. Otherwise, I would jump back into the chapter that focuses on what is actually here Marx's critique of Hegel. So Marx seems to position himself here between a materialist Kant and an idealist Hegel. And whether Hegel is an idealist is disputable. The appropriation of the real world by way of intuition and conceptual representation does not bring the world into being, does not cause its existence. A realist reading of Hegel, for which thinking and reality, concept and world are ultimately the same, is ruled out. However, reality is not simply given outside the cognizing mind. Abstractions are already existing in the actual world in the form of social relations. Marx's dialectical materialism thus tries to salvage Hegel's critique of abstract thinking. While Hegel's dialectical mode of presentation remains valid as a method, for Marx at least, of the intellectual reproduction of the concrete world by means of intuition and abstract conceptual representation, this reproduction, in theory, is not the production of the concrete world itself, at least not for Marx. Unlike an absolute idealism of Hegelian fashion, and again, this is a vulgar Hegelian fashion, being is not ultimately thinking and vice versa. Of course, for Marx, too, the mediations and transformations of being and consciousness are dialectical. Yet conceptual mediation is never a predicate of existence. Here, of course, you hear the echo of Kant. Against the dual background of Kant and Hegel, Marxist dialectical materialism performs a kind of original reproduction of the concrete world, since his critical method does not succumb to the dualist empiricist or vulgar materialist or neo-Kantian worldview of two unmediated worlds. The one external being out there, the other internal being in the mind, and hence compelled to simply copy, reflect, reproduce the former. Such a flat theory of reflection would remain within the worldview of unmediated categories of the mind and an independent, uncritical world outside. Marx's point is that being and consciousness are inherently mediated. Hence, his dialectical materialist method investigates the social forms, characters, and embodiments this inherent mediation assumes. Maybe here we can stop. Just saw there was actually no, that was not a question. So we could go back to Jamila's paper, of course. Jamila would say Marx's critique of Hegel is unfair. It is a problem to assume that this ascending method, abstract, simple determination, glued together with more complex abstract determination, less abstract determination until arriving at concrete totality, is not just a mental, intellectual operation of reproducing the real world in mind. No, it's the actual ontological, if you want, the real mode of creating the world. This is modernity, as in Hegel's philosophy. This is a world where cohesion is produced through separation. And the whole point of splitting up that question between an ontological question and an epistemological question is already a symptom of vulgar materialism. This could be held against Marx here. Depends, of course, on how do you read Marx's point vis-a-vis Hegel. But without siding here with either side, I think it's important to isolate or to reiterate again this second notion of abstraction, which is, of course, real abstraction. You can even say, if abstraction is not abstract thinking, your eggs are rotten and your family is horrible and what you wear is colored by the rotten eggs and so on, all this kind of tokenism and reducing a person to under one general trait. If this is ruled out, abstraction is real. There is no point of saying real abstraction. Because otherwise, abstraction is mathematical thought, or you can ask the ancient Greeks, or you can ask the Egyptians, or you can ask Willem Borringer about empathy and abstraction, how primordial art, objects, cave painting is already abstract. That's not the point. The point is to understand abstraction as an ontology of the social fabric. That is real. It doesn't need actually the adjective, the predicate of realness here. The question, of course, is how does this change our reading of Marx? What are the stakes of that reading? And what do we do with my other favorite author, Alfred Sonretel, of course, which would then be the next take on real abstraction. But it makes sense to have a short break here before we move on. We could already jump into one of the papers if there are specific questions. I remember Maya had one, but I think it relates to the Sensuous Supra-Sensuous paper, right?
Yeah, and it's really kind of specific, and we probably, it wouldn't make sense to ask it until after you discuss real abstraction, like Zonradel. And
yes, we need first take 3. We had Hegel, we had Marx. Marx, we can say it's a bit undecided is whether he follows Hegel, yes or no. We need now another attempt to think real abstraction, where actually real as a predicate adds something to abstraction. That would be Sonretel. Of course, this is still something I would like to do today. And the specificities of, or what follows from that reading, I'd like to discuss tomorrow when I look closer at the more complex argument regarding the parallel reading of what are value relations in the symbolic order of language versus capitalism, which is a reading through Lacan and Samo Tomčic's book on Marx and Lacan. But
Quick
Alan,
question.
say something. Alan,
Is Alan going to go?
I mean, yeah. Well, I wanted to go back and now we're seeing this guy and ask about the relationship between Lukács and Benjamin and Brecht, and the Lukács's concept of and call for realism, which he opposes to kind of like a super sensual or like a sensual a bourgeois naturalism, and then also like the surrealism which he sees in James Joyce. And but I wonder if the kind of realism which he calls for and sees in Thomas Mann can really be, is it really the same as either like the Brechtian alienation effect, or like the productivist, kind of like real engaged kind of art and literary practices that Benjamin talks about in the Author's Producer. Does that make sense, or by?
No, I get your point. I mean, it doesn't mean, I just shared the slide again. Pointing at Brecht and Benjamin, it's my old hobby. I'm a Benjaminian. Yeah. Everybody knows. Surprised that I chose Benjamin and Brecht, as my memory is bad. You can have any other example that comes up with a non-naturalist understanding of photography, a non-naturalist understanding of realism.
Right.
Of course. But that was just handy to bring this in.
Oh yeah, no, like it was great, and actually I recently wrote something on it, but I couldn't figure out how to reconcile Lukács and Benjamin, and didn't even.
Yes, because of Verdinglichung, because of reification.
Yeah, I mean, are they are they saying the same thing about realism? And then, if so, where does it fall out with the issue of like socialist realism versus like abstract, constructivist or productivist, kind of art practices, which were like also like opposed. But it seems like that there's, two different conceptions of like the real versus the realistic, or the realist.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is like a fine distinction, but then it was like enough for people to get into the Gulag over. So, yeah.
No, thanks for reminding us. Of course, yeah. First of all, Brecht. He didn't have the big beef with the big fight against Lukács yet in 1930. That's kind of funny. He uses the term Verdinglichung, reification, whereas a strong copyright on that notion that points to Lukács.
Right.
And then they had later, Lukács and Brecht, this debate, this kind of different trajectories of reading Marx in the 30s. That would be a seminar of its own, which is worth actually looking at, what different concepts of reality, real social relations are meant there, but I wouldn't assimilate them directly. Actually,
Yeah.
I didn't discuss here Verdinglichung, reification, other than I would say it's another way of pointing at the non-empirical materiality of sensuous supra-sensuousness. And if you want, I could also have pointed at Guy Debord and would have said the spectacle
Yeah.
is a sensuous supra-sensuous
Right.
entity. It's
Right.
not a picture, it's not a representation, it's not a copy of reality. And if you go further, then you can do the same with, not the same, but you can give further instantiations of that argument when you read Baudrillard. Probably you can also do this with Rancière. But my old hobby is always Benjamin and Brecht, so I slid back to them. But
No,
it doesn't mean to exclude other ways. But for me, the most important thing is that we can allow for that third realm. If you bring in psychoanalysis, Lacan, for instance, you would also immediately have a triad, the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic.
right.
And in the symbolic and in the real, you would find grounds for something which is the sensuous super-sensuousness vis-a-vis the imaginary. So there are different theoretical designs possible to point at that. It's not the copyright of them, also not of Marx, and probably not even of Hegel.
Right. Cool. Well, thanks a lot for the great talk here. It's pretty good to see you guys.
Thanks for the question, Alan. I also saw there was another question which said, are we already ready for all-round broader question? Totally, we are all the time. These introductory slides already cannibalized subchapters of the two papers. We haven't done Alfred's und Rethel yet, but it would only take 15 minutes. So, but at any moment we are ready to jump into a broader discussion.
I'm happy to wait until you've done zone refill because I wanted to push back a bit in a broader sense and talk about reification as well as abstraction.
Yeah, I also.
Yeah, I had a question as well. I see there's a question in the chat, so I could go. Sami, is that all right if I ask you a question?
Of course, do it. I just stopped sharing because I can't see enough. Say it again.
Oh, I didn't ask the question. I was just, preliminary. Well, hi. Yeah, hey. Yeah, I noticed when you talk about it, you mentioned Sanrethel, and you say, well, it's implausible that abstraction tout court would be, a consequence of the commodity form, for example. And I mean, I think there's certain misconceptions about Sanrethel that prevail, but I think they partly owe to ambiguities in his own work. But if I understand intellectual and manual labor properly, his claim isn't that everything that could be subsumed under the category of abstraction is a consequence of the commodity form. His claim would be that it would be more that, like, if you look at the category of like number or quantity, right? So he actually contrasts, quotidian language, right? To the development of like numerical systems, right? Which he attributes to commodity exchange. Of course, like this is dismissed by someone like Moïse Postone, for example. But I think Postone performs a gesture which is a little bit illegitimate in relation to Sanrethel's work, because you get these sort of weasel terms in Postone's work where he says things like the commodity form of social relations. And one thing that's not, I would say, I don't think it's argued, to a satisfactory degree in time, labor, and social domination, is that a kind of assumption which exists there is that if you don't have really, I mean, relative surplus value, right, then that you don't have consequently the real transformation of social reality, as a consequence of, the commodity form, right? But this is quite questionable, right? I mean, like, I think if you look at somewhere like, ancient Athens, which is, I think, significant to how we, our conception of philosophy, these categories, it was like a real theater of like maritime trade, right? So compared to most parts of the world, you had a very, very active, sort of instantiation of the commodity form in that context. But this is still something that, would have been a relatively isolated manifestation in that time. So I was having, I had a discussion with Etienne Balabar that dealt a little bit with this the other day. And, he was talking about, we were discussing a little bit like the difficulties of this, but he was just pointing out that, it's very, very important when we talk about the commodity form to talk about the particularity of its historical generalization and manifestations. And I think, unfortunately, there's a tendency in some of our more contemporary discourse to treat it as a sort of simple periodization, right? Like, capitalist social relations, not capitalist social relations, right? Whereas, Ernest Mandel, for example, will talk about the way that, labor quantities accounting very clearly appear, right? I mean, even Marx in the Grundrisse, he says absolute surplus value is a merely formal change, right? Compared to, the shift that occurs with relative surplus value. So I'm very uncomfortable with the Bostonian account. And it's a weirdly pedantic position. Like, maybe you'll remember from Time, Labor, and Social Domination. Like, he talks about like Chinese, like the system of double hours. And he says, oh, well, this isn't abstract time, which he attributes to capitalism because it's not numbered serially, right? But he totally omits to discuss the fact that, a lot of people argue that in the late Song dynasty, for example, you had like early elements of manufacturing capital that were more developed than anything that you see until, Europe many centuries later, right? So I just wonder about, about these sort of, to say, well, this couldn't have existed before. I think the history of the exchange relation is extremely complex, right, in terms of how it functions historically.
Yeah, I take this as an addition because we are not yet there. My defense of Sonretel would probably be almost like yours. But no, I don't have the urge to point it against Moïse Postone. Actually, I cannibalized his work only insofar as it serves my argument. But the problem is interesting if we want to historicize abstract thinking as something that came up with Kant's transcendental subject, where abstract categories in their ahistoricity, in their seemingly universal applicability, have a history. And this is why I would definitely go to Sonretel for a Marxian reading of Kant.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my reason. I'm not against Postone or Postone's problem for me is mostly about his under-complex notion of historical time. Actually, time, labor, and social domination. Time. It's basically, he offers us an Aristotelian concept of time that is not enough for that we need in Kapital, Volume 1. But this would be really, it's another paper, it's another topic. So I rely on you, on your addition.
I think, and I just want to add too, that I think that, the other thing about the argument that Sonretel makes about the Kantian categories of pure understanding being related to the exchange abstraction, I think, and again, by the way, when I raise these things, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, you're doing this, right? I'm just speaking generally about the discourse. But I think that's an interesting one too, because I think sometimes when people read that, there's a tendency, because of his presentation, because he introduces that before he discusses the historical account, to say, oh, Sonretel is saying that, the Kantian categories of the pure understanding can all be found within some like a priori notion of exchange or concept of exchange. But it seems to me that the account is quite particular to a certain moment, right? Which is when the exchange abstraction is transmitted to labor in the form of the commodification of labor power. So I think all these moments have to be kind of historicized in relation to the account. But again, there are problems with this account, certainly. I mean, but we could, I don't want to, we can discuss it after. It would be more useful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually not yet on that level, I have to admit. I'm just on that very basic level to explain to the non-expert what was the argument of Sonretel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's useful if used in a critical manner. Or it's basically with any kind of drug, the dose makes it. So don't do too much. But there is something interesting to Sonretel, I think, which is really worth talking about now that you have brought us here. I have 3 more questions I saw in the chat.
Sure, yeah.
Very important. I would like to talk about them. They relate more to what I'm going to do tomorrow. Why Aura and Benjamin could be another way of pointing at the sensuous supra-sensuousness. Why did I actually use the term aesthetics, such a heavily loaded term? Why would I do that? Is there also a different notion of the aesthetic maybe that goes back to rhetorical forms, to a way of how in symbolic orders meaning or value is being created? Something like that, which is more, I saved it for tomorrow because I thought I should do the 3 takes on what is real abstraction today first. So maybe there's still time in the 3rd section. We still have a break and then we do a 3rd one today. Maybe we can already point at it and take these questions further to tomorrow's discussion. But I think now is the time to talk a little bit about Alfred Sonretel and his famous equation. The form of thought is the form of commodity. The secret of the Kantian transcendental subject is in the commodified exchange relation. It's as simple as genius. And when you think about it, it's just too genius to think there must be a mistake. Why did it take so long for Sonretel to spell out the most crucial point or the entry point, how you can not reconcile, but how you can combine ontology of capitalist social relations and an epistemology of these social relations. And maybe I'll start with 2 quotes. They're also on the handout. They're actually taken from Intellectual and Manual Labor. I think it's still the only text, or at least of this project, that had been translated. I heard, though, that friends and comrades are translating Sonretel now into English, also the earlier Lucerne and Paris exposé. Again, how can abstraction be real? Take 3, Sonretel. So our explanation thus argues, as he says in the introduction, that the Kantian categories are historical by origin and social by nature. For they themselves effect the social synthesis on the basis of commodity production in such a way that the cognitive faculty they articulate is an a priori social capacity of the mind. Again, social capacity of the mind, not logical ahistorical. Although it bears the exactly contrary appearance, that of obeying the principle of ego cogito. So the Cartesian subject, obviously, and also the Kantian transcendental subject, has a history, a hidden history, a secret history, a repressed history. And that history is to be found in capitalism, in the specifically commodified formal commodity exchange relation. So the view that abstraction was not exclusive property of mind, but arises in commodity exchange was first expressed, according to Sonretel, in the beginning of Kapital and earlier in the critique of in the contribution to the critique of political economy of 1859, where he speaks of an abstraction other than that of thought. So this is the reading that he offers us. I could read with you maybe a couple of passages, it's just two longer paragraphs actually, on Sonretel, and then we can maybe discuss Sonretel. So in his reading of Marx's Kapital, and don't forget, Sonretel in the 89 edition of Intellectual Manual Labor, the German second edition, he says he basically had only one thought. He was obsessed with one idée fixe, and he tried it 7 times. He called it 7 attacks to get this argument through, why the form of commodity is the form of thought. And in this reading, which really stretches over, starts in the late 20s and until his death, 1990, Sonretel coined the term real abstraction, characterizing an abstraction from use value actually performed by economic agents in the act, you could say in the performance of commodity exchange. In bracket, this performance or act actually remains unconscious. Whether it can be made conscious or reflected is a question that maybe we can discuss tomorrow. Following Sonretel, the coin, the money sign, is the historical as well as logical origin not only of commodity exchange but also of the Kantian transcendental subject, its pure concepts, categories, and the pure forms of intuition, time and space, structuring the logical and aesthetic forms of cognitive knowledge and experience. Of course, if you read more closely, one has to specify that. The logical origin and the historical origin is not the same. We already heard that. And it's important to keep Conrad's comment in mind. Sonretel does not say the moment abstraction has been intellectually invented in history is the origin of capitalism or vice versa. Otherwise, the Greeks would already be, or even earlier, the Phoenicians would be capitalists. In this way, the coin is not just money in its instrumental economic sense, like the mediator of exchange that maybe the Phoenicians already had, but also the logical origin of everything which the ancient Greek considered as koinos, common or general. But this is our reading of the ancient Greeks and what they thought is common and general. It's not that the ancient Greeks already had real abstraction in this capitalist sense. He's very precise with historicizing, periodizing this argument. Money designates the ordinary token, commonly accepted sign of economic value, and at the same time the shared common structure by which the subject's cognitive faculties are structured. The capacity of spatio-temporal intuiting and the faculty of apprehending the manifold and determining its general features by means of intellectual abstraction. Just to remind ourselves, Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason mentions 4 categories or pure concepts: quantity, quality, relation, and modality, not existence. These categories underpin any logical judgment and provide the a priori framework for conceptual knowledge which operates through conceptual abstraction. This a priori capacity to abstract, however, is not only intellectual but shares its seemingly ahistorical logic with the historical practice of abstraction operative in economic exchange relations. Here it should be said, in capitalist economic exchange relations materialized and contained in the money coin. In other words, real abstraction does not only refer to the prevalence of exchange value over use value, but produces the universalizing form of commodified exchange relations beyond, or rather before, the intentional preferences of economic agents, Commodity exchange, the act of equating social labor by exchanging its products as commodities, performs a real abstraction which remains unconscious. Yet this real abstraction is objective and real, therefore not subjective or thought-induced. With Sonretel, we can claim the Kantian a priori, or pure forms of intuition and understanding, without which the subject cannot perceive and apprehend sensations, have a history, a repressed history that remains unconscious and unrepresentable from the standpoint of the Kantian transcendental forms, which are otherwise in Kant ahistorical. The Kantian transcendental subject emerges with with the beginning of capitalism, with the universalization of the commodity form, when the commodity form becomes the dominant social relation among other social relations, but it is also the social relation which mediates between other non-capitalist social relations. The argument sounds simple. It is, can we think of abstraction other than something that comes from mind, which maybe we only find in mind, but its origin is somewhere else? And this genealogical account, of course, is a bit problematic if you have a more Hegelian framework, because that argument runs the risk of splitting the world into logical validity, Geltung, and historical genesis. And how you interweave that, and how do you give a precise historical, you can say, imprint to the commodified version of exchange relations? This is the way how to read and salvage the argument. I can here only refer to one of the best readers that I know, to my knowledge, contemporary thinkers of Alfred Sonretel, Frank Engster, and he also recently had been translated more and more, I think, in Historical Materialism in the journal. And if you're interested in that, I urge you to follow Frank Engster's work on Sonretel, who has a very precise, also Hegel-informed, Hegelian-informed critique of Sonretel, but takes him as his entry point. I mean, I also take Sonretel as my entry point, but I'm not or less interested in a Hegelian or Hegel-informed critique of Sonretel. I just find it only interesting that Sonretel, in the earliest passages, it's the second chapter, asks himself and the reader, where shall we start, with Kant or with Hegel? And without further ado, and really only a couple of lines, he chooses Kant. Okay, you say he comes from the neo-Kantian school of Southwest Germany and Rickert and so on. And he credits Hegel for the inventor of dialectics. But I think that Jamila Muscat has a point when she says there is a reason why Sonretel was not able to credit Hegel as well as one of the theorists of abstraction. And this is kind of that huge gap in Sonretel, and that's interesting. You can say it's a symptomatic omission. However, I would still claim Sonretel's reading of Kant is valid, instructive, and the benefits of it might be paid off by the deficiencies. But I mean, we have more than Sonretel, and we can skip. We have 3, 4 or more ways of thinking of real abstraction. Yeah, I was just about to say that. Kirill Ilyenkov, those who were in Beirut when we discussed it will remember I owe this insight to Angela Harut-Junyan. Yeah, of course. If you want another understanding of real abstraction that doesn't do the Sonretelian, that doesn't push the Kant button too early, Sonretel, but goes with Hegel, then you have Ilyenkov. Yes. A materialist understanding of the ideal. It's a great text, and I hesitated for a long time in preparation whether I should bring in Ilyenkov, but I wasn't even done with Hegel when I thought about it, so okay, we'll never be done with Hegel, of course, I know that. Yes, please, Ilyenkov, definitely. You have another approach at the same time. I mean, you can also go through Pashukanis and through Rubin. You have a lot of critical Marxism in the early Soviet Union. Very few actually survived. Ilyenkov did. But that would be another seminar, which could be actually called, anyways, it's funny to call that whole thing Western Marxism. What actually means Western here? Non-Western Marxist theories of real abstraction. That would be an interesting topic, and I think Ilyenkov should be discussed first. Then another attempt would be what actually means the Hegelian understanding of, let's call it social abstraction, real abstraction, this synthetic fusion of abstractions to arrive at concrete totality in science, in mathematics. Then you are with Damerow and Wolfgang Lefebvre. It's also a super interesting discourse that can be used as a critique of a bourgeois epistemology of science. So it's very narrow, what I'm presenting here. It's just Sonretel, but maybe a common starting point can be found in the parallaxis of Kant and Hegel, in the midst of which you find the work of Marx. And of course, then you have different theoretical decisions how to read Marx. With Kant, with Hegel, or neither nor, and you go with Spinoza, for instance, Althusser. Okay, but let's maybe open the debate again. I think it's very important to maybe wrap up these were only 3 takes on real abstraction. We have a different understanding of abstraction. Marx calls the commodity a sensuous supra-sensuous thing. This is why I still sensuousness. I still called it aesthetics of real abstraction, only because of the German wording, sinnlich, übersinnlich. And took it in the other paper to a different side, where I tried to understand what are the aesthetic modes of creating meaning and value in language. Symbol could be one of them. And to read this again against how value is produced in capitalism. One more spoiler for tomorrow. It's Marx himself who likens commodities and the medium in which commodities talk to each other, of course, money, to something he calls Warensprache, commodity language. And but that already adds another layer. Maybe we stop here because I see here already points we should discuss. First, I scroll up, sorry for that, because we left out a couple of questions here. Ali, are you still here? I think the concept of aura as another instantiation, Benjamin's theory of aura, as a sensuous supra-sensuous, I wouldn't say masking, but as abstract labor is made of that stuff, if you want. Could be employed, and I'd like to do this tomorrow, and it would be a very fruitful perspective on our discussion tomorrow. I hope you're with us tomorrow. I see you still there, but maybe we can discuss this tomorrow. Svantje also asked, exactly, this was the question about aesthetics, the aesthetic, why? And I think it's an open question, and it's a very important question. I haven't answered this properly. For today, I would say sensuous supra-sensuousness is something introduced by Marx, and that aesthetics might be, or modernity can be called as, or why prima philosophia was aesthetics in modernity, why this is so. It's an interesting question that maybe we want to debate with Benjamin and Rancière, why this so, but I would keep it open. However, I will shift the realm of aesthetics to away from the sensuousness or sensuous perception. By the way, perception doesn't have to be sensuous, to symbolic orders and to rhetorics tomorrow. Yes, Ilyenkov we discussed. Maybe a naive question. No question is naive. I wonder how can real abstraction be brought into line with Hegel's theory of the subject as substance. If the subject as substance is non-reversible, how can there be a subject in real abstraction? I think this is one of Marx's criticisms here. The subject in real abstraction must be reversible or needs to occur first as a logical subject and then be superseded. The logical subject is a reified subject in the sense, and a subject that can be superseded by a higher non-reversible process of social abstraction. Oh, this is an amazing question. And whoever posed this, please discuss this with us. As a short answer, I would say, if the substance of value is abstract labor, then the subject, where substance becomes subject, is then capital, of course, when value becomes the subject of a process of its own self-valorization. And that there is substance is only so because there will have been, in this retroaction, that there will have been surplus value, i.e. capital, that it will have been already be a subject of its own automatic process, which is the fetish of capital, as Marx criticizes. So is this then irreversible? This is exactly the question, whether we could say, is a decommodification possible? Or could you keep real abstraction as a form of mediation, or form of mediation is wrong, real abstraction as mediation? Can you keep that? But could you get rid of its capitalist shape? And I think this is in the end of Jamila's paper quite amazingly put when she says, maybe real abstraction is irreversible, but that doesn't mean that we always have to, that we are stuck with the capitalist mode of real abstraction. So there is no need to eternalize and reify capitalist real abstraction. There's different modes of, let's use proper Hegelian terms, alienation, of Entfremdung, of mediation, of social mediation, possible. You need mediation, but it doesn't have to be capitalist. So I think this should be allowed as an argument. And this is always the danger. If you collapse the critical tension between Marx and Hegel, and you flap them onto each other, yeah, then you have no chance to ever exit this train. Then the system, then everything, then Capital Volume 1 is the science of logic, and that's it for you. That's for us. There is no escape. Of course, I would say to keep them apart, read them, of course, to illuminate Marx with Hegel, for sure. But to keep them apart is necessary. Otherwise, we don't need, there is no critique of political economy. We can just stop here. But I'm using Hegel as you want, if you want, as a dialectical materialist firewall against, excuse my words, the objective stupidity of our age that assumes a standpoint of immediacy when discussing social mediation and capitalism. And I think I need Hegel. I need the Hegelian understanding of abstraction to come to terms with what Marx is talking when Marx is talking about abstract labor. Abstract labor is not just an abstraction from given, concrete, existing, empirical, sensuous, labor that is there. It's not an add-on on top of something parasitical or whatever. It's not. It's in the fabric of the social. And that doesn't mean that the tension between Marx and Hegel has to be collapsed. I think let's keep this in mind. I would say I have no good answer to that, but this question is the question of all. I mean, that's the whole raison d'être of critical theory. If Marx, or put it this way, if Hegel is already Marx, we are done. Then end of this story, but it's not. And that's good news, I would say.
Can I just add something to that, Sami?
Yeah, please.
So again, I think the issue here has to do with like the commodity form versus capitalism. So Marx says that Hegel's logic is the logic of political economy, but that's not the same thing as saying that Hegel's logic is restricted to, well, this is really complicated. That's not the same thing to say that logic, tout court, right, is restricted to the capitalist mode of production. I mean, I think one way maybe to broaden, the thinking of abstraction, right, without, abandoning a sort of material template, is to conceive of sort of the porousness and progressive and transformative character of Hegel's system as having to do with a system that's based on the self-valorization of value, right? The constant reproduction of value, right? So this is to say that, formal logic, right, the logic of negation, may arise from categories of substance, which are postulated in relation to something like the money form, right? But it's only when you have self-valorizing value that you have the reprising of that into a form in which logical contradictions appear as progressive and historically transformative.
Yeah, but danger. I mean, is Hegel's science of logic formal logics? No.
Well, but that's what I mean. But I'm saying capital isn't.
Yeah, but listen, it's not yet capitalism. Otherwise, we are done. If science of logic is Capital Volume 1, that is very bad news for us. But the opposite is also untrue. It's not that science of logic is just formal logics. No, it is ontology and epistemology all together. It's all that formerly was known as metaphysics. And there is no logic here, metaphysics there, and whatever, a philosophy of consciousness.
But that makes sense because capitalism encompasses all of social reality at a certain point.
Oh, sorry.
That makes sense. That makes sense though, because capitalism encompasses all of social reality at a certain point. So it makes sense that what initially started as these deterministic logical applications, right? And by the way, that will, and as Mendel says in the commodity form, that continue in communist states, right? And will continue to after capitalism, right? You're not just going to get rid of the commodity form. That's different than capitalism, right? But the commodity form.
Yeah. Wait. These are many arguments. First argument is Capital Volume 1 is not a science of logic. I think we all agree. Otherwise, we don't need to move on. Then we are doomed in capitalism. Second is that Soviet Union also was state capital and had commodities yet organized the state. Yes, but this doesn't mean that every future society has to be a commodity organized society. What it means is that you may have something like a real abstraction and forms of alienation and the social organization of mediation, but that is not necessarily organized along the lines of the commodity form. This is a different argument. So the failure
Yeah,
of
I mean,
the Soviet Union doesn't cancel out the possibility, at least, of having a non-capitalist mode of real abstraction, I mean, a non-commodified, if you want, if you have something else, a different form of social mediation. So, I totally agree to your reading that we have to distinguish here between Hegel and Marx, but and I think now you clarified, and I also insist on your clarification that, of course, Hegel is not offering us just formal logic in science of logic. Dialectics is not a mental activity or hobby of theoreticians. No, it's the real, it's the fabric of the social works like that. And that there is a homology or isomorphism now between our intellectual abstractions and the social abstractions enacted consciously, unconsciously in our activities in capitalism is something to debate. And so Sonretel, with that straightforward identification, is maybe too fast. But to put them into different continents and say, yeah, here we have a history of science, logical forms, and so on, and here we have economy and so on, that would of course be something we would rule out, and that would be a bourgeois scientific standpoint. But we cannot identify them too quickly, neither with Kant nor with Hegel. I mean, there I'm with you.
I think yeah, I mean, I think for me the difficulty is, like, I guess, I think if you say, well, the categories of substance as we understand them, and there are different words like this, right? We can talk about like hypokemenon, and there are different Greek terms, but if we talk about categories of substance as being related to commodity exchange, then what I think you would have to postulate is that, and by the way, I agree that society, theoretically it can go beyond the commodity form. I'm just remarking that socialist societies have not, to this point, whether one deigns them to be legitimately transitional or not, they have not done that. And it seems quite futuristic in a way. But what a society would look like, because what this would mean is that if a society's logic or metaphysics, whatever, were to transform in accordance with the abolition of the commodity form, that would require the abolition of categories of substance as we know them, which obviously is very difficult to project. But I think, again, in Sonrethel, what one has to understand is, like, if you think of the way normal language functions, right? It's not based on, like, something can be a sort of provisional category, right? That's used in language, but it's not based on, I guess, what you could call sort of reification of what those categories are, more like quantity or number, what you see with the emergence of currency starting in the 7th century BC. So there ceased to be those sort of reified categories at all. And I just think it's very hard for us to think about what abstraction would mean without commodity exchange, right? If you adopt that historical account, right? And I'm not saying we get rid of Hegel. I mean, because it's just like you don't get rid of capitalism. I mean, that's a moment,
But wait,
right, in a dialectical progression.
I'm not a Greek. So since I live in capitalism, all of my understanding of abstraction will be tainted by capitalism. If I were an ancient Greek, I would tell you something else about abstraction, but I can read it. I don't understand what you actually mean by this, because maybe I totally misunderstood what all of you meant by substance. In a very vulgar sense, substance in Marx is a social relation. the substance of value is abstract labor. Abstract labor is a purely social relation in which no gram of atom enters. So, and that this becomes subject simply means that this social relation is in motion. It only exists as the subject of its own process. That's why the substance of value put in motion then is this pseudo-automatic subject as capital. That's my vulgar understanding of Marx. Everything else I don't really understand, because the problem of substance is for me no problem. The problem of substance is not there. Substance is a social relation. Capitalism is one social relation. I can think of other social relations. Other social relations have different form of real abstraction. It's no problem for me. But now you ask me, of course, then tell me, what is your other social relation as substance? And then you got me, because I don't know. But I would just say, I would keep this open as a possibility. Not any substance put in motion as subject has to be the capitalist one. But now you will say that you know about that is only thanks to the capitalist notion of abstraction. Yeah, you got me, it's true. It's true. But this doesn't mean that this is a circular argument. We know that real abstraction creates a world of uneven and combined abstract social relations, which constitute what we may call in Hegelian parlance concrete totality. So in these gaps, in these mismatches, I think there is a possibility of thinking about a different substance as social relation. I mean, just as a possibility, but I can't tell you which one. So I think this way we don't have to rule out any understanding of real abstraction so far. It's too early to do that. But it is worth contemplating again that in 90% of our everyday interaction and also intellectual activity, we have a notion of abstraction which is pretty close to what Hegel otherwise has called abstract thinking. And that's why I think this discourse is so relevant. Without having made any decision on what would be a non-capitalist form of real abstraction. This is what is
yeah. I agree with you. I guess and I'm not gonna, I agree essentially, but I just want to say that the only thing I'm getting at is that I just meant, especially if one ties up, because you're talking about, you're talking about labor as the substance of value, which, really isn't fully actuated until the law of value, right? But of course, value in the commodity form of a older history than that, I guess what I'm saying is that if one ties up very early notions of substance in philosophy with the value form, then it just tells us that the challenge we're talking about, which is to eliminate the commodity form, not just to eliminate capitalism, right? Because we shouldn't just simply lump those things together, right? It's more complicated. Capitalism is more like the apotheosis of the commodity form than the commodity form itself. Then the question of what a non-capitalist or non-commodity form of abstraction would look like becomes quite challenging, right? And even Hegel, you can say look at the labor of the negative, right? Well, is that just, the primacy, you have transformation and then you have the labor of the negative. I mean, is that self-valorizing value and value is labor, right? And then is that acceptable as a, as a way of thinking beyond capitalism? So it's very hard. And I agree, but all I wanted to do is sort of frame the gravity of the challenge, I guess.
Thanks a lot. I totally agree and also understand now what you mean. I just go back to the question. Yes, Kirill, say again, which question?
Oh, I haven't said it yet. So I'm approaching very similar topics from a very different Marxist tradition, and specifically, I want to push back against the claim in the Muscat paper that the social is equivalent to capitalist social relations. I don't really accept the absolute subsumption, but so not just Ilyenkov. So back in the 20s, Vygotsky was writing about the reification and crystallization, including of artworks and linguistic science. And he talks about, for example, so let's say someone built a road. I'm in London. I want to get the road to Manchester. I don't have any representation of the road to Manchester. It's not in my mind. I just get on the roads to Manchester and stay on the roads to Manchester. But the builders who built it had an image of the route between here and Manchester. So it's reified in the road. Similarly, with a chess piece. But the point is that in Vygotsky and Ilyenkov, things are more or less concrete with respect to each other relative to specific activities. If we take an activity like chess, it predates capitalism and it's not related to capitalist exchange. So what I take the reading of Sohn-Riefel that you've given and the overall project is to take the famous quote by Marx, the existence of things qua commodities and the value relations between the products of labor, which stamps them as commodities, have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom, and to ignore the qua commodities bit and to say, well, everything is a commodity. Well, I think both Vygotsky and Ilyenkov give a plausible alternative of how things through crystallization accrue use values, and we can push the hermeneutic button, or Ray Brassier has that paper, Dialectics Between Suspicion and Trust. I absolutely appreciate the suspicion side of it, but the exploitation of the workers who built the road isn't necessarily what's determining the function and the use value. So just very quickly to finish the chess example, updating Vygotsky through John Hoagland, the activity of chess, that activity, that social recognition and the historically accumulated form of the chess pieces is what determines the use value. And the form absolutely relates to the use value. So chess doesn't fix certain things. I can have a piece that's made of glass. I can have a Disney character bishop. I can have a digital bishop. But for me to recognize something as a bishop fixes its shape and position on the board, and the temporality, it can't suddenly change position when I'm not moving it. The mutual recognition involves the crystallization of the labor of the activity of chess that has been very gradually reshaping what the rules of chess are and what the forms of the pieces are. So each chess piece is crystallizing that activity, but that activity is not capitalism.
Yes, and you have many more activities which are non-capitalist, by origin at least. They may have a capitalist function. So you would allow, of course, for many activities and many social relations. One of them is capitalist relation, the relation between labor and capital. You may say crystallized in the buying and selling of labor power. But then you have also money as the mediation of other mediations. So capitalism appears twice. Once as its specific capitalist social relation, and then as the relation that mediates all other social relations and activities, including the specifically capitalist social relation. Maybe you are also a wage laborer who plays chess for someone who, like me, is too lazy to do that. This is not ruled out. I think there is no contradiction. The problem of use value how the, let's put it, the fate or the trajectory of a commodity as a singular individual item being determined by use value or by value. Of course, you cannot decide that as if two things were living different lives. I mean, they're always together, glued together, and a thing doesn't have a use value as a commodity when it is nullified as value. You may have a different non-capitalist theory of use and function, and I think in modernist aesthetics we find a lot of hints towards that, but that has nothing to do with use value. Use value in Marx and Kapital just means that whatever the use is, it can be sold. And sold means here, or bought, it is an item or a medium or a symbolic chain of signs. I mean, we also have immaterial commodities, or not immaterial, that's actually wrong, non-empirical commodities or performative commodities, something that can function as the transitory medium of value. So what you want from use value is not ruled out, but rather is enabled through this indeterminacy towards the particulars and the particular form of the use value and the particular intentions of those involved. It just means it can function as the material bearer, or medium if you want, transitory medium of value. That's all. So that's why I don't understand why a certain logic of abstraction that crystallizes itself in particular use values would contradict a theory of value as a theory of real abstraction. It would rather give a good argument for possibilities, at least thought possibilities, of non-capitalist, not anti-capitalist, just non-capitalist forms of real abstraction bound to use values. However, you would also need a mediation of these use values. And the form of this mediation is not inherent property of these use values. So there's not much said about use values other than they are being sold for whatever reason. You see, I don't think that this is a contradiction. It becomes a contradiction if you, a bit like the question before, or my conversation with Konrad, if you tie too closely a certain reading of Hegel to Marx, then it becomes a problem. For what I was doing here earlier before, these introductory slides, I was only doing kind of a preparation of an argument for a different notion of abstraction. One way of a different understanding of abstraction that goes against merely a generalization of a given world. And here I think we are on the same page. But I think the floor is open for thinking about different forms of real abstraction that, for instance, crystallize in particular use values. And in the end, the entire chapter on great industry or general intellect materialized, technology materialized in great industry, shows us how these particular expressions of, with Sonretel, I would say, and also with Ilyenkov, real abstraction can become the transitory media or vessels of value. However, we know that these use values do not produce value. So I see this as complementary.
Can I maybe respond to, because it was sort of he was commented on pushing back against what I was saying as well. Yeah, so I'm a bit just in terms of where you're coming at, Sami, I guess like terminologically, I find it like a bit strange, just because, you know, for me, real abstraction is not even like, because you have two kind of definitions of real abstraction, right? You have the Toscano definition and you have the Sanrethel definition. And the Sanrethel definition is literally just the concrete / abstract character of commodity exchange. And then if he's talking about philosophy or science, he says like ideal abstraction, thought abstraction. And then you have Toscano who will be like, well, religion is a real abstraction, you know, use it in this much more general way. So maybe the way you're using real abstraction is more commensurable with the broadening of the semantic context of the term, which has happened more over the past 10 years. But I just want to say with this, so you talk about chess. Well, that's very interesting because, you know, of course, chess is not, I mean, it originates, I think the precursors of it in the 7th century BC in India. So about exactly the time Sanrethel is talking about in Greece. And we know that India commodity markets were very, very developed, which had a big influence on Greece in terms of trade and so forth, because they saw themselves in relation to the East. Chess doesn't come from capitalism, but you know, if you look at chess, I mean, again, I can't look at all the different iterations of the game, but the idea of having like two juxtaposed sides, right? Black, white. You know, of course, in chess, you can exchange pieces. We know that when people record chess now, they look at pieces in terms of points. Again, you'd have to go through, and I can't go through and look at when all these things arose. But the point is just to say that I think it might be going too fast to suggest that chess is not, even if, okay, like people playing chess in this kind of society, maybe it was totally defined by, you know, it was totally outside of the, you know, directly market mediated sphere, as Maya would say, of course. But at the same time, I think that it might be going too far to suggest that the use values involved in chess weren't somehow already being conditioned by processes of commodity exchange. And that's the thing, right? I guess this is what I would get at. In capitalism, you know, what we think of as use value, you know, processes of appropriation are organized so as to support, you know, very monolithically in many cases, so as to support processes of exploitation. You know, in any earlier society in which exchange exists, you really have to look at the social formation. But just because capitalism doesn't exist doesn't mean that there hasn't already been some organization of the domain of what you'd call use in relation to the domain of exchange, right? But that, again, I would stress that in earlier modes of production, it's not going to be monolithic in the same way, right? So I think that kind of question, I wouldn't just take something and say, well, this isn't affected by commodity exchange, or, you know, I think it's extremely complex, you know, historically. That's what I would respond. Sami, you got to unmute. Are you?
Sorry, yes, that was a police car crossing here. Yes, I think that helps us, and also that sharpens maybe the terminological complication. We have 2 or 3 understandings of real abstraction. I would still sign with Muscat's Hegelian understanding of real abstraction. And what more and more is urgent here is that we understand that use value is not use. Use is an abstraction, and then it would be a transhistorical category. And use value is not a thing. The commodity is a split. It's not 2 things put together. It's a split entity. Use value, exchange value. So, however, in capitalism, use value appears as that kind of appendix to value. And that's why I would be cautious, and I think you also meant it this way, when we have pre-capitalist societies that have use and different specific understandings of use and function, that we do not conflate this with use value in capitalism. Because we can, with good reasons, say that most use values of commodities are absolutely useless, especially the commodity of labor power that produces these useless items. And that's probably something we could agree on. But again, this would be a different theory, towards a non-capitalist theory of use. For the moment now, I wonder what shall we do. I was just looking again at the other paper that we haven't discussed yet. I thought that tomorrow we have competing yet different competing understandings of real abstraction. We have a first inkling on what is sensuous supra-sensuousness. We ran a little bit through Marx's first chapter, and we have an understanding of Marx's method or mode of presentation of this ascending from the abstract to the concrete totality. That would set the floor for the stage for tomorrow's argument on allegory, symbol, and the argument that Sami Khatib makes in The Capitalist Unconscious with Lacan and Marx. And I'd like to do that if there is interest for, because some of the questions that we didn't discuss today, including Maya's point actually at the second paper, which was the earlier one, which has a lot of not fully developed arguments. So it's actually something that we could do together tomorrow in a discussion. I don't know, how is the mood? I'm sharing briefly the other paper with you and tell you what would be my highlights here that I'd like to discuss. I'm going towards the beginning. Real abstraction I wouldn't discuss again, since we had this already. I mean, also the famous image of the animal. I'd really like to discuss that section 2 on economic and linguistic value and a different understanding of the aesthetic could be derived from that, if there's interest. And I've prepared a little bit on this already, some slides. The spectral materiality of Wertgegenständlichkeit could be another take on why we don't have that's wrong. Why do we have so little about use values? Why there's only a functional understanding of use value in Marx? Or why we cannot demand from Marx what he's obviously not doing. So this is not a totalizing theory that has everything in, but it's on a very specific point on how the commodity form develops into capital. That I would be happy to discuss this as well, maybe in a shorter version than we have in the section. Commodity language and its secret would be very, very important for me. It draws on Werner Hammerer's essay on commodity language. We haven't discussed it all so far. There's also a certain theory of money implied here. And if there is still time, yeah, the capitalism as religion part, I'm not so super interested anymore. It's an earlier reading of Benjamin's fragment on capitalism as religion, but this would be up to the study group, and similar allegory and capitalist Dingwelt I definitely would like to discuss, because that would give us a different understanding of the aesthetic as well. That also goes back to Benjamin and the Baudelaire essay. This would be my plan for tomorrow. I know it's a lot, but I'm happy to hear about preferences and how I structure it tomorrow.
That's cool. Yeah, I'd like to talk about, tomorrow would be cool to talk about language and real abstraction, because I was trying to figure out if your paper is like trying to talk about the relationship between real abstraction and language in a really broad, like, historical sense, or whether it was just trying to talk about like the structuralist schematization of language. And maybe I just didn't read close enough, but I think it would be cool to talk about.
It does both and neither nor. It would like to, it tries to point at that which is unhistoricizable when you try a historical presentation. So it operates with the Freudian category of the unconscious, obviously. And exactly as you say, it's in between the two, or neither nor. What remains non-historicizable in the historicization of real abstraction? And maybe we can also use the last section of the other paper. It's problematic reading, but I found it always kind of compelling. Slavoj Žižek's earlier reading, I think 89 was the book, what was it called? The Sublime Object of
Ideology, yeah.
Yeah, where he says, you know what, that's the unconscious. Real abstraction is unconscious and has this kind of weird but compelling reading of Sonreto, using him only obviously to have the term real abstraction. We can also go there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like when Zizek like is like, I don't know how. I mean, I like Zizek, but I don't know how. When he always focuses on this impossible element, right? And I wonder to what degree that's not historical.
I will do what the majority of this group will decide. So tomorrow you got to vote for it. Not formally, of course, but you can say it in the chat box. However, I will prepare a reading through the earlier paper, the Sensuous Supra-Sensuous, the aesthetic of real abstraction, if there is no objection.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, then I would let you go to whatever time zone you are.